Now, this morning we are going to be digging a bit into communist propaganda techniques. Now, we've already related to our previous audiences here at this school how I myself first became involved in the communist criminal conspiracy by joining a communist front, Cambridge Youth Council in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I related that I was greatly puzzled by the success that the communists were having in victimizing innocent individuals. Obviously successful. Now, if you have any doubt about the record, I would suggest that you might write to Washington, D.C., to your own congressman, and ask your own congressman to send you the guide, G-U-I-D-E, the Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications, because it is an education in itself. You will find 140 pages. You will find 8, 9, 10 organizations listed on every single page. It is simply staggering to discover the success the communists have had, because the story of every communist front is the story of innocent individuals victimized. Remember that there's a big difference between a communist organization and a communist front organization. A communist organization is composed of communists. Communist front organization is composed of non-communists. 95% of the young people who joined the Cambridge Youth Council listed in the Guide to Subversive Organizations, 95% were non-communist, had not the faintest idea that the organization was dominated, controlled by the communist criminal conspiracy. Same is true of American Youth for Democracy. 95% of the young people who joined AYD did not know that all of their top officers, Don Bolin, their state president, Bernice Rogers, their state secretary, Herb Philbrick, their state treasurer, all of us were secret communists, all of us taking our orders and instructions from Communist Party headquarters, District 1, Boston, Massachusetts. And so the Guide to Subversive Organizations is a dubious tribute to the skill of the communists and to the success that the communists have had in victimizing non-communist Americans. It is an amazing, amazing picture. And I must say that as I observed this from inside the communist ranks, I was not only amazed, I was not only shocked, but I want to assure you I could not understand how in the world the communists were able to do it. How could they do it? Well, it took me quite a while before I began to catch on. Now, as you start into the communist movement, the communists don't reveal all of their secrets to you right off. They can sure bet that. When I first joined the Young Communist League, the communists did not open up their training program with a Communist Party manual and organization, which states specifically that it is the policy and purpose of the Communist Party to work towards the destruction of our government by force, by violence, by bloodshed. No, indeed. Communists knew that at that time with these young communists, if they hit them with that kind of a message in the beginning, they would probably run, not walk to the nearest door, and they'd be gone. Now, indeed, turning a person into a communist is a fairly long and involved process. It doesn't happen overnight. It is not an easy task, and the communists work at it diligently. Finally, however, after you have moved deeply enough into the communist ranks, then you find that they indeed do teach some very specific things. For example, in the Communist Party manual on organization, we find on page 8 a chapter having to do with the role and aim of the Communist Party. What do they say? Quote, as the leader and organizer of the proletariat, the Communist Party of the USA leads the working class in the fight for the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism, for the establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat, communist form of government, for the establishment of a socialist Soviet republic in the United States. The strange thing is, however, that despite the fact that this is what communism stands for, many non-communists cooperated with the Communist Party, actually helped the Communist Party, gave their names to the Communist Party, contributed money to the Communist Party. How did it happen? Well, I found out that there were several tricks to the trade, and I began to learn this when the communists, noting that I was employed in the advertising profession, decided to put me to work in what they called the Agit-Prop Division, AGIT-PROP P-R-O-P, agitation and propaganda. And it was there I worked for most of my 9 years in the Communist Party. At first I began as simply designing leaflets and brochures, making the design and layout for this material. Later on, the Communists gave me the responsibility of actually preparing some of the copy for the propaganda messages. I know I was given one job of working on a manual that was used for the actual training of communists, so that I was involved in teaching other communists Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, which was a pretty good job for a counter-spy for the FBI, I must say. Now, after I started to work at Communist Party headquarters, I observed, first of all, the fact that after these communists prepared their messages, and then they were ready for distribution by printing or mimeographing or other form, the communists were very careful to always remove the Communist Party label. They'd remove that label, and they'd apply a new label, let us say American Youth for Democracy, at the present time the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. False labeling was one of the keys to their technique of victimizing people, but even this didn't explain the reason for the amazing amount of response and success that was obtained. But I began to notice on the bookshelves, and I noticed in the hands of the communist propagandists, books by a lad by the name of Pavlov, and the light began to dawn. The light began to dawn, and I found indeed that these communist propagandists were great students of the Soviet scientist, or Russian scientist, I should say, Pavlov. Now, Pavlov, a non-communist, was a legitimate Russian scientist. No question about his integrity or his learning or his brilliance. Indeed, it was through Pavlov that we now have a great deal of information that perhaps we would not have, or at least would have taken a lot longer to discover. Pavlov, you'll recall, was the lad who observed that if you placed a plate of food before a dog, saliva would begin to run in the dog's mouth. And Pavlov noticed that this seemed to be an automatic response. In other words, the dog didn't seem to think about it. He didn't seem to consciously order the saliva to run. It seemed to happen automatically without the dog's thinking about it. And so Pavlov wondered, well, could it be that there is a special section of the brain that automatically triggers these responses? And if this is so, what kind of responses are these? Well, it turned out that Pavlov was indeed right. He was correct in his guess. And indeed, there is a special section of the brain which does exactly that. And you'll remember Pavlov's famous experiments, for example, his experiment with a dog, wherein he would place a plate of food before the dog, but every time he did that, he would ring a bell. Ring a bell. And he kept repeating this over and over again. Plate of food, ring the bell. Plate of food, ring the bell, until finally, he could place an empty dish before the dog. No food in it. Ring the bell. The saliva began to run in the dog's mouth. Now, the animal's thinking processes had been scientifically short-circuited. The animal had been conditioned to respond to a false impulse. And the communists noticed this. And they said, this is a very clever little trick. And if this clever gimmick can work on one form of animal life, it can work just as well on other forms of animal lives. And we communists know that man is an animal. Man is an animal. There's no difference between the dog and any other form of animal life. And if these scientific facts can apply to one form, it can apply to another form. And so this is the basis, this is the foundation, this is the root of communist propaganda techniques. In fact, the communists talked a great deal in our cell meetings about Pavlovian, sometimes Pavlovian psychiatry, but now they claim this to be Soviet psychiatry. This is a Russian invention, you see. Well, now, the reason why the communists feel these things can and do apply to humans has been brilliantly pointed out in Dr. Fred Schwartz's testimony concerning the communist mind. I know that many of you are familiar with his testimony. If you aren't, you should not only study, but believe me, you should memorize this testimony. It is one of the most brilliant pieces of testimony given before Congress in a compact form, giving, I think, in a fewer words, the greatest understanding concerning the way a communist mind operates. Now, Fred Schwartz has pointed out that communism has given its philosophy certain scientific laws. And he points out that these laws are as follows. The first one is, there is no God. They are proudly, unashamedly atheistic in theory and in practice. When they deny God, they simultaneously deny every virtue and every value that originates with God. They deny moral law. They deny absolute standards of truth and righteousness. An entire civilized code of moral and ethical values is destroyed. The second law of communism is that man is a material machine. He is matter in motion and nothing more. Man is a body, and he is completely describable in terms of the laws of chemistry and physics. Man has no soul, no spirit, no significant individual value, no continuity of life. He is entirely an evolutionary product and subject to the modification, adaptation, and transformation by the applied, established laws of animal husbandry. Now, this is indeed what a communist believes. Man is a machine, a machine. Now, the communists know that we Americans are conditioned to respond to certain word impulses. Word impulses, not just the ringing of a bell, but certain words. There are certain words, for example, whether we hear them or whether we read them, to which we have been conditioned to respond from our earliest childhood in a favorable way. There are other words to which we are conditioned to respond in an unfavorable way. Let us see how this actually works in practice. I know that yesterday I said I was going to be telling you about brainwashing in the United States. And I know some people must have said, well, Philbrick, now you're going way out on a limb. This can't be. We know, of course, been brainwashing in slave labor camps in the Soviet Union or in Red China. But it can't be that people have been brainwashed in free America. Well, let me give you one example. Let's take a look again at this Guide to Subversive Organizations and Publications. And incidentally, if your congressman should write back and say that is out of print, and it does happen to go out of print from time to time, you write another letter back to him right away and say, sir, get that book back in print and hurry up. Or we'll see that you get back out of Washington, D.C. Now, when you get this little booklet, open it up just to page 1. You don't have to go any further than that. Page 1. What do you find? You find there a little paragraph describing a very successful Communist Party school. Now, this Communist Party school was organized by the Communist Party. It was operated by the Communist Party. It was controlled by the Communist Party. And this particular school, which operated with great success in Chicago, Illinois for a period of time, was also helpful to the communists in raising money. They raised thousands of dollars through this school. Now, what did the communists do? What did their Pavlovian or Soviet psychiatry tell them? Did they go up to a man's door in Chicago? And did they knock at a door and say, sir, will you contribute to the Communist Party school? Well, they sure didn't, because their Soviet psychiatry told them, well, this was a word, symbol, to which most Americans or most people in Chicago area are conditioned to respond to in an unfavorable way. So unfavorable, they might get socked in the eye or kicked down the stairs. And so what did they do? They went up to the same man's door and knocked at his door and said, sir, will you contribute to the Abraham Lincoln School? Fellow says, sure, I believe in Abraham Lincoln. Here's my $10, $100, or whatever it might have been. His thinking process is short-circuited just long enough, and that's all it took. Now, this same trick has been worked over and over again, and you know, it's like these magicians' tricks. One of the reasons why magicians get away with it is because they're so simple. And you're looking for something awfully complicated. Well, here's one of the simplest gimmicks or tricks in the world. And it has worked over and over again. They're still working it today. Now, go through the rest of that booklet. For example, the communists accuse us of being super Americans. We're super patriots. We are chauvinists and all that sort of thing. Go through the Guide to Subversive Organizations, their own list of names. And what is the word they use more than any other word to apply to their own subversive organizations? American. American. Over and over again. Why? Because they believe in America? Of course not. That's ridiculous. This is a word symbol. Simply a grouping of letters to which we here in this country have been conditioned to respond to in a favorable way. You'll find words like peace and freedom and democracy. What do they call their slave nations in the Soviet Union? People's democracies. These are cybernetic symbols or Pavlovian symbols designed to get a favorable response. How about the word peaceful coexistence? It's not an American term. It's a Russian term. First used by Lenin way back many years ago, then used by Stalin, and now being used by Khrushchev. These are word symbols designed to lull us to sleep. These are tranquilizing pills in the hope that we Americans will be lulled to sleep so that we will do nothing. So long as we do nothing, they can continue to win. Now remember, brainwashing is the trick of deceiving a person without the person's knowing it's happened to him. Incidentally, the use of the names of individuals. Why are they used? Why are they used? Why did they have Herb Philbrick's name at the top of the letterhead of the Cambridge Youth Council? Because Philbrick was known in the Boston area as a Christian youth leader. He was known as a young advertising executive, member of the Advertising Club of Boston, and Advertising Federation of America, and so forth. Here was a symbol, you see, designed to mislead or confuse anyone who might have any doubts concerning that organization. What about the list of names we mentioned yesterday? You find on the letterheads of all the Communist Front organizations the names of prominent individuals. Why? These are Soviet psychiatric terms designed to mislead or confuse. One of the great tragedies is that the communists always seek to use not only their old fellow traveling names, but in every new front, they put a great deal of effort into obtaining the names of individuals who are not communists, who have no connection with communists, who cannot be accused of communists, but whose names are very helpful and very valuable to the communist criminal conspiracy. Let me give you just one example, another example of how this was done. We told you yesterday of how the communists also gave us, our Young Communist League, the task of raising money for the party, and how one of the most successful money-raising organizations was the National Council for American-Soviet Friendship. See the words used? Friendship. What American doesn't believe in the word friendship, you see? And we related how a great many good Americans contributed to that organization. Thousands of dollars through that one group. Now, in addition to the name of the organization, which the communists used, we Young Communists also were armed with a letterhead of the organization. A letterhead beautifully printed on fine stationery, list of names down the left-hand side of the page, prominent names in the community, but right at the top of the letterhead in big, bold, black letters, very prominent. On this letter authorizing us to collect money for this organization, they had the name of the Massachusetts State Chairman of the Council for American-Soviet Friendship. What was that name? Bishop G. Bromley Oxnam of the Methodist Church. Now, why was that name there? Was it there because Reverend Oxnam is a communist? Of course not. It's much better for the communists to use the name of an individual who's not a communist. Now, why the value of that particular slogan? This meant nothing to the communists, only that this was a word symbol which were designed to short-circuit people's thinking process just long enough until they dropped their dimes and nickels and dollars into the plate. Why? Because here is a word symbol which would mislead people into thinking this was a legitimate organization. Here's a word symbol to which people's minds are conditioned with the idea of giving or contributing, you see. What better symbol could they possibly use? Well, you will find, as I say, a fantastic number of examples of this Soviet psychiatry or cybernetic warfare in action. Now, we've been using the word cybernetics. The word cybernetics, incidentally, has a legitimate meaning. The science of cybernetics is a legitimate science. Our own scientists, in fact, if there are those here today, and I know there may be, people here in the electronics field, or perhaps in the field of electronic calculators, or in radio or television, they will be familiar with the term cybernetics. And they will know that the science of cybernetics has to do with the improvement of the flow of communications. The improvement in the flow of communications or information. The science of cybernetics has made possible the development of these huge electronic magnificent calculators. Science of cybernetics has made possible the improvement of flow of communications or information on a telephone line. It used to be that only one message could be conveyed in one direction at one time on a telephone wire. Now, through the science of cybernetics, they can pour hundreds of messages at one time, simultaneously, on a wire running in both directions. They've improved the flow of communications tremendously. Telephone companies use the science of cybernetics to a fantastic degree to improve the flow of communications or information. What in the world has this got to do with communism? Well, nothing except that, again, remember the communist picture of a man. A man is a machine. A man is a machine. He is matter in motion and nothing more. The nerves in our bodies compare to coaxial cables or telephone lines. They're simply means of conveying information or communications. The brain cells in our brains compared to the transistors or the electronic tubes in an ordinary electronic brain. No difference. No difference, basically, scientifically, to a communist. Now, what about the electronic brain? An electronic brain is a machine which has been conditioned, preconditioned to respond to certain impulses. It has been conditioned, for example, so that if you punch a hole in a card in a certain position, built into that machine is a response, or what they call a feedback. So that when you feed that card in, automatically the machine bounces back, let us say, with a number 3, a conditioned response. So an electronic brain to a communist is just another continuation of the same science, you see. Now, if we communists can control electronic brains, we can control the human brain as well. Why? Because their definition of the science of cybernetics, their definition is the manipulation and control of information. The manipulation and control of information. What does this mean? Well, this gives us the reason why the Iron Curtain exists. The Iron Curtain exists not only in terms of the barbed wire entanglements, not only in terms of the machine guns and the police dogs and the strip of plowed land. The Iron Curtain also exists in terms of jamming stations. There are 900 jamming stations all up and down that Iron Curtain. Why? To try to prevent the flow of information or communication from the free world into the enslaved people. To cut off that information. I worked on the staff of the New York Herald Tribune for 8 years. Russian people are forbidden to read the New York Herald Tribune. Exactly 6 copies of that paper goes into that country every day, and they go to the Kremlin, and that's all. 6 copies. And other than that, nobody in the Soviet Union is permitted to read that paper. Why? Because in order to control the people, you have to control information or communications. And then you control all of the avenues of the radio, of the newspaper, of books, of magazines. All communication is controlled, and then scientifically you pour into the avenues of communication only that information which will cause the people to respond or to go in certain directions, and you withhold all information which will cause the people to respond or go in a direction you might not want to have them go in, you see. Thereby, we communists can control people as human robots just by pushing the right buttons at the right time, and they will respond. Well, now, thank God we can report that this scientific trick has not been completely successful. As a matter of fact, it has broken down many, many times. But at least this is the theory, and it is a dangerous theory, and it is an extremely dangerous practice. Why? Because it has been used not only behind the Iron Curtain, but our own country as well. As we've gone through the investigations of communists in our land, you will find a large number of names turning up from Hollywood. Why? Are they out there for their health or for the nice climate you have here? No, indeed. Communists are in Hollywood because they've been ordered to go to Hollywood. And where do you find the communists? Who are these people? They're the script writers. Script writers. They're not the set designers. They're not the stage people. Very seldom do you find a cameraman. I can't recall of a cameraman being a... They're script writers. They're the people who have control of the information or the communications channels, you see. We find Albert Maltz, for example, identified many times in the investigations concerning communism.